This is the final, I believe, session of the committee's inquiry into the future of the BBC. And for our first panel this morning, I would like to welcome the chairman of the BBC Trust, Mrs. Rona Fairhead, who is returning before the committee. It seems only a couple of weeks since you were last here. David Liddermont, who is a long-serving BBC trustee, and John Zeff, director of the BBC Trust. Perhaps I could just begin by asking you to set out how you see the role of the trust in the charter renewal process, as opposed to the BBC management executive.
Well, I think the trust role is there to represent the licence fee payer. Therefore, I think that's the lens with which we will be viewing the charter review. Clearly, we have a role in overall governance and strategy, and so we will set the broad strategic framework for the management and the executive to work within. And in fact, we had, on my first day in office as the BBC Trust, we had a meeting, a combined meeting of the Director General and the executive team, the full executive board, and the trust and trust officers, which was really to set some of the strategic context for the BBC for the future. So as I see it, we will be sort of guiding that overall direction. We will be giving feedback from the licence fee payers' view, so the public's view in terms of the renewal. And we will be, I imagine it will be a rather iterative process, so we will see what the public is saying that they want. We will then consult with the public, and we will then go from what is it you want, therefore, and a costing of how much that will be. We'll then challenge the value, the efficiency of that, and then we'll go back to the public with these are the options, and try to come to an end point. Ultimately, the executive will come with their plan, and we will have the final sign-off in terms of their plan and their proposal.
But you don't envisage the trust making a separate submission to the BBC executive?
No, I think it will be an iterative process with the executive. The final report that come out will be a joint report which will be approved by the trust.
Okay. Conor Burns.
Welcome as your first visit as the new chairman. When you appeared before us at the pre-appointment hearing, you talked quite a lot about your business career in a number of very significant commercial organisations. I would be very interested to know your sort of initial reactions when taking up your post, what sort of things you found, what sort of questions you've been asking.
Well, this is only my second week, so there is a limit to how much, and I've spent the time getting to know people and talking and getting broad views from outside and within about the BBC. The thing that strikes me still is the amount people in the outside and inside really care about the BBC and care that it is a strong BBC that fulfills its role at the heart of the creative sector of this country. I'm probably more convinced of the economic benefits it brings to this country, the skills training, and all of the development that it can do for this country, and the way that it can establish this country's place in the world. So I think that was what my view going in, and it's been reinforced very strongly. I think that I have also been struck by the quality of programming, by the focus now that the Director General has put on quality creativity. So for example, I was lucky enough to go to the preview of Attenborough's new Life Story, which was just glorious. And so I think that sort of quality programming, has to be at the heart. In terms of the other thing which I did focus on, and I will continue to focus on, is the need as a representative of the licence fee payer for value for money. And I have been pleased by the sense that there is a culture. I don't know what the culture was like before, but there seems to be a culture now that it's about how can we make sure that we're doing this efficiently, as I said, I believe in my pre-appointment select committee. I don't think that is a road that's ever finished. Anybody who's been in business the last few decades know that it's a relentless journey. But I do think there is that culture now and acceptance that for us to justify the public's faith in the BBC, we need to make sure that that the executive is operating the BBC as efficiently as it can, and so we'll be continuing to challenge that.
And have you been asking questions around, you talked about the financial side of things, have you been asking questions around financial accountability?
Yes, and I think that was, to my mind, there is much greater clarity than there has been perhaps in the past between the role of the executive, the role of the executive board. The executive board now has an audit committee and a remuneration committee, which I think are very positive steps forward, just an ability to focus in a way that I think you would expect. I think that there is the oversight and the standard setting and the rule setting at the trust level. I still would like to make sure that there is real clarity about the handover, who ultimately is responsible. And I think on both those areas, in remuneration and audit, I think I'm going to be just making sure that in particular instances everybody knows, where the buck stops, and so that to my mind is important.
And accepting that it's very, very early days, how would you compare the quality of the answers of your requests for information, particularly around financial information, with your experience in the private sector?
I'm in about 10 days. I now see the positive news, I would say, is that there is now shared data between the trust and the executive and executive board, which, as I understand, is a step forward. And to my mind, it's absolutely critical that there is proper flow of information. But so I think that's a positive thing. But I might be able to give you a better answer. I think it's just too early for me to opine in any credible way.
Has anything surprised you?
No, no. I think I was well informed before I came in. I had the opportunity before I started to talk to a number of people, to talk to every one of the trustees before my first day, by people from outside, and people are very happy to tell me just how challenging the role is. So nothing has really shocked me.
Tracy Crouch.
Steph, can I ask you, you were the government's head of broadcasting policy and led the charter review for DCMS the last time round. The review you started was 3 years before charter expiry and undertook an enormous programme of consultation and independent research and reviews in order to inform the decisions that were made by the department at the time. Are you concerned that the DCMS has not yet started the charter review?
No, the last process was long, and it did involve a lot of public consultation, which I think is an important part of the charter process. I don't think it needs to take that long. I think it's perfectly possible to run a process that is open and has appropriate consultation in a shorter period of time. And I can see, and actually I think in the circumstances, it's a welcome decision by the government to be clear that it won't start the process until after the general election under the circumstances.
So all that work that took place over the period of 3 years prior to the last charter review, was that just a complete waste of time and waste of money?
No, I think that process fitted the circumstances at the time, fitted what's the way that ministers wanted to approach it at the time. It started very quickly on the heels of a major new piece of communications legislation which had completely redrawn the legislative wider regulatory map and had also raised a lot of issues around the BBC at the time as well. I think the process did take, from beginning to end, a long period. There was quite a long, because again there was a general election in the middle, there was quite a long hiatus around the election. it was a very iterative process, again, with a number of stages. I think, as I said, it's perfectly possible. There are no rules about how one conducts a charter process, and clearly it will be for government to set the overall terms of the process. But it's perfectly possible, as I said, I think, to do it in a shorter period and still be open.
Is this just because you've gone from poacher to gamekeeper, and actually at the time it was in your interest as head of broadcasting policy to have a very long charter review period, and now you're at the BBC and you'd quite like a shorter?
I think it's probably gamekeeper to poacher.
No, I think circumstances change. I think the process that was run at the time and that I ran working for ministers at the time, as I said, was appropriate for the way that the government then wanted to run the process and the circumstances that we were in. I would be hesitant to draw too many parallels because I think things have changed a lot in the intervening period. The market looks very different, audience expectations are different. So the framing of charter review this time is quite different to last time. And as I said, I think it is possible, perfectly possible, to run a good process in a shorter period.
So what areas of research do you think needs to be conducted to inform the charter review? What are the key aspects that you think should happen within that review period?
Well, clearly there is still thought to be done and planning to be done around exactly what happens and what is looked into over charter review. But I think at the bottom line, it's important to understand audiences' expectations, changing the way that audience behaviour is changing, what people expect of the BBC, not just in terms of the direct services it provides, but also in terms of the wider economic impact that it can have for the UK, its role internationally as well. I think all of those things are important to look into and gather evidence on.
A lot of witnesses have come before this committee and expressed concern that the charter review hasn't yet started, but you seem to be giving a very different impression that actually you're not worried about it not starting until after May 2015. So, would that be a fair reflection, or you're just not worried that it's being delayed, that the amount of work that went into the previous review is not going to be replicated this time round?
I don't think it's been delayed, as I'm saying. The government has made clear that it won't start. It will start after the election. And I think it is for the government to set the timetable and the process for charter review, and I don't have concerns about that. The important thing is that it is an open process, is based on evidence and takes account of public and audience views and expectations.
Isn't the danger, though, that by delaying it until after the next election, that the voters who own the BBC won't know what they're voting for at the next election? And doesn't that make it absolutely essential that the political parties make quite clear what their intentions are with the BBC before the election in their manifestos?
Clearly it's for the political parties to decide what they put in their manifestos. That's clearly not something for us to try to dictate. But I think actually the BBC as an independent body, and the independence of the BBC from the political process is absolutely critical. Actually, I can see that there are some benefits from having a charter review that is separate and after the electoral process.
But the Trust's job is to represent the interests of the licence fee, and the licence fees payers will be going into the election blind unless the parties are quite clear about what their intentions are.
Well, I think the charter review process, as I said, is the right time and the right process to take account of licence fee payers' views.
You might have a government in power that wants to abolish the BBC and no one would have known about it. So the point I'm making is, if you're so relaxed about this process being delayed, do you not think, as people who are supposed to represent the interests of the licence fee, not defend the government or any political party, supposed to defend the interests of the licence fee, that political parties owe it to the public to make it absolutely clear what their intentions are going to be with the BBC after the election if they win power?
As I said, I don't think it's for me to tell
You're supposed to represent the
what
licence fee payer.
Yes, and I think the way we represent the licence fee payer is by understanding where licence fee payers are and by saying, as I've said, that and doing our utmost to ensure that the charter process, when it comes, is one that takes proper account of licence fee payers' views and audience interests, and that it is an open process.
Angie Bray.
Thank you. Can we look at the input that audiences and licence fee payers have on determining the scope and scale of BBC? If I can ask you, Mr. Littlement, in reality, what influence have audiences and licence fee payers had on determining scope and scale of the BBC during the present charter period?
I think that we hear a lot from the audience, and we do a lot of research with the audience, and particularly around service licence reviews, which examine how effectively the BBC is doing its job in terms of delivering its television, radio and online services. And at that point, we get a lot of voluntary reaction from the public, but we also do a lot of research to understand what they like, what they don't like, what they think the BBC should be doing that it's not doing, and that feeds into the service licence process.
But is that a sort of formally structured kind of consultation you're talking about?
Yeah, it's the service licences are written out, and they set out what each BBC service is supposed to be doing. We review that twice in the charter period to satisfy ourselves, one, that the licence is still fit for purpose, that actually audience needs and the market changes perhaps mean that the service licence needs amendment, but particularly to satisfy ourselves that the ambition in the service licence are being realised. To do that, we ask the public, we ask the licence fee payers what they think. We invite stakeholders, we invite commercial competitors of the BBC to give their contribution to the process, and we do a great deal of research with specialist research organisations so that we understand how the licence fee payer are feeling about the service. In our recent review of BBC Television, for example, it was clear that we were getting a signal from the audience that they were beginning to feel that BBC One was getting a little bit stale, a bit samey. So that was reflected in our review, and I think in due course we'll see the BBC responding to that.
But the Trust is, what, nearly 8 years old,
Yes.
and yet it was only last year that the BBC's governance review recommended that the Trust expand its programme of public consultation. I mean, why did it take so long?
I can only say that I think in anything which keeps our focus on licence fee payers seems to me it's got to be a good thing. If that means more consultation with the audience, we should do it. There's a
But it's been a bit slow, hasn't it?
I think we have been doing this for 8 years. We've reviewed every BBC service once, about half of them twice, in which in each review we have consulted with the public and licence fee payers. When we revised the BBC editorial guidelines, which is the Bible against which the BBC's editorial standards are judged, that went out to public consultation. Now, it's quite a difficult thing to get the public to opine on. It's quite a hefty document, goes into great detail about BBC standards. In that case, one needs to do a form of deliberative research where you get a group of licence fee payers together and take them through some of the changes to the guidelines to get some sense of how whether that, as it were, reflects the BBC that they're watching, the BBC that they expect. I think that kind of work constantly feeds into what we're doing.
How do you select the licence fee payers to consult?
Well, we use research companies who are specialists in dealing with audiences and get the appropriate cross-section of the public involved.
Ronnie, can I ask you, I mean, do you feel this is a process that ought to be progressed further? I mean, how important do you think it is that the licence fee payers are properly consulted about?
The research I've seen is very sound research, and I think if you ask pretty much around the BBC, people would say that the research done by the Trust unit is of high quality. It's well focused and it's of good quality. I think the changing technology of the world should allow more informed and richer information. If you just look at the information we get because of people's use of online technology now, we can see what they're using, when they're using it, and that's in some ways a richer type of research, because it's not people thinking about and intellectualizing what they think, it's what they do. And so I think that there is, in line with a lot of companies around the world, I think the BBC is realizing the value of using those sort of data analytics, to use the term.
So it would be a priority for you to be building on this?
I think we need to. I think that's definitely something that the executive are doing themselves in terms of understanding their audience, and it's something that I think is a very efficient, cost-effective way for the trust to continue to glean public opinion and understand the behaviour of listeners, watchers, users of online, and I think that's important.
Okay, thank you.
Steve Rotherham.
In 2010, I'm just actually finishing the stuff up. In 2010, the strategy review laid out a series of core principles, such as doing fewer things better and maintaining distinctiveness. We heard from a number of witnesses, actually, some claiming, for instance, that the BBC shouldn't now be doing things that commercial stations are doing equally as successfully. Channel 4, for instance, accused the BBC of spreading itself too thinly or attempting to be all things to all people. Professor Charlie Beckett of the LSE said it was trying to do everything. So in regard to those criticisms, what things do you think that the BBC need to do fewer and better? And does the BBC distort the media market?
Well, that's a lot of questions. In terms of what should it be doing better, I think the clear part is, as I would believe is in the trust, and what we hear the audience saying is they want quality programming. So that's very clear. I think the other is about balance, and there is one view that says if you should only do programs where there aren't commercial examples. I think that would be too far, and it's absolutely not what the public want. And I think, in fact, that was some evidence to this select committee, I think from Dame Tessa Joel, who said that her going in assumption was that the public didn't want entertainment on the BBC, and in fact the public said, absolutely we do. So I think if you have a universal service, one that's for all members of the public, you have to get the balance right between having an appropriate level of entertainment, popular programs where you might meet against the commercial players, but that equally the BBC should be doing programs which are always of good quality and which address particular areas as well that aren't met by commercial. So I think it is a balance. In terms of the areas of focus, again, I'm clear that the sorts of areas that the DG has focused on and said that the BBC has to remain in: news and current affairs, very clearly; natural history, science, again, very clearly; drama and entertainment, but with that balance that I mentioned before, particularly. And obviously sport, because part of the BBC's role is to create that glue and cohesion for the United Kingdom, and I think big sporting events, the Olympics, the Commonwealth Games, do just that. On the point of does the BBC distort the commercial world, I would say a couple of things. Clearly, if you have an organisation that is funded to the tune of over £3.5 billion, then there will be some impact. That's clear. The issue, to my mind, is to make sure that it doesn't distort, but it in fact enhances competition. And I think the data would show that the existence of the BBC has resulted in the creative and media environment of the UK being one of the one that is looked at as in the world as one of the exemplars of creative media, using innovative technologies, good programming, intelligent program, quality program, be it the BBC or our commercial players. And if I look across the cross-section of the media world, it's a robust, vibrant market, which is something I think that BBC contributes to, doesn't detract from.
I think a lot of that was about the qualitative aspect of the question. What is it that you might do fewer?
I think that will be part of the public consultation. I think that the level of funding will clearly dictate what we can and what we can't do. So I think that will be part of the process, but I think it's for the public to help us decide where we should be making the investments and where we have to pull back. And I think that's absolutely part of the Charter review. So I can't give you specific examples now, and I don't think it would be right to, because we're just about to go into a Charter review, and that, to my mind, is clearly what it is. And if it's a reduced budget, then clearly, in a world where costs, are rising, where there's more competition, then that will necessarily result if there's any reduction in materially fewer programmes. And I think the public needs to opine on whether that's what they want. I think there is another element on the commercial side which the Director General has made public of what they're looking at, which is looking at how production is managed, looking at the whole quota system, and we in the Trust are about to do our review of the window of creative competition. So I think that there is work ongoing to say, where can we be most effective and not butt against commercial, and it's a difficult area, which is why I think the Director General has put it out to consultation, and we will clearly be seeing the results of that. But it's early days in that process.
If I can just take back and ask the other two witnesses if they want to supplement that. But if we can just take it back and turn the first question on its head, do you think that it's appropriate for the BBC to enter into new markets, to develop them, to invest in innovation, and then for commercial markets to be putting pressure on the BBC to pull back so that they can take over the market share?
Look, the answer to the first is yes. I think part of the heart of the BBC is to help innovation for the BBC, for the creative community, and build skills. So if I look at, not just the iPlayer, but a whole series of initiatives, innovations the BBC has brought, those have benefited the market at large. So I think the iPlayer is looked at, even from some of the big technology providers in around the world, as an outstanding piece of technology at the time. We have graphics programs that are the same. We have the red buttons. CFAX in its time was revolutionary. I think that's what the BBC can and should do. The idea of, should you do it in partnership or should you share, I equally think that's a sensible avenue to go down. Should it be sort of wrested from the BBC so the BBC can't use it? No. But I think more partnerships in this world are sensible.
John or David?
Can I say on this whole issue of distinctive programming, it seems to me the licence fee underpins a range of shows, programmes from the BBC, which are unlikely to have emerged in the pure commercial marketplace. That's the core of what the BBC does. And it adds real value to the quality of our lives, given how important the television set is and the radio set is to people. So I think, and the public tell us, we do every year we do a big survey with the audience about the public purposes that the BBC is delivering, public purposes laid down in the Charter and Agreement. And the public tell us that they expect from the BBC that they give them fresh programmes, new programmes, distinctive programmes. That they expect from the BBC that the BBC reflects all parts of the United Kingdom, and there's something for everybody on the television and the radio and online. Different cultures within the United Kingdom should be reflected there. And a lot of our work at the Trust has been focused on that very issue. And inevitably, you will hit the grey area where a very popular piece of television is seen by a commercial network as being their territory. The happy outcome is when the BBC comes up with a show like Strictly Come Dancing, which is a huge hit. Everybody loves it. It brings the nation together on a Saturday night, and not in a million years, and I was in commercial television for many years, would a commercial TV station have come up with a show built around ballroom dancing about 10 years ago. So that's the BBC at its absolute best. It's being very popular, it's being universal, it's bringing the nation together, but it's doing it in a way that the market is not delivering, thereby adding value. On a Saturday night now, you can watch The X Factor, you can watch Strictly, and everybody's happy. That's a great place for British television to be. And you know what? Those formats are exported all over the world. So that's a good win for the BBC and for the commercial system as well.
But is a lack of distinctiveness then the fact that you competed against X Factor with The Voice?
No, I think the lack of distinctiveness, yes, is when you see programmes which seem to be imitative of programmes from elsewhere. And The Voice was accused of being that, and undoubtedly a singing talent competition, the X Factor, Pop Idol, and The Voice is clearly a singing talent competition. It's got differences, it's got its own spin to it, it's arguable how distinctive it is from those shows. It's proved to be very popular, particularly with the younger audience. I would like to see the BBC, as much as possible, focused on fresh and new, innovative, original ideas, preferably created in this country from a fertile creative community, to generate its schedules. But from time to time, its obligation to serve all audiences means that it will pick a show like The Voice, which has proved very successful in attracting that younger demographic, which is part of what the BBC needs to do.
As part of our inquiry, the committee has done an e-consultation with Student Room, getting the views of young people. They've confirmed what I think a lot of us were aware of already, which is that more and more of their consumption of television is done online and through catch-up services. How do you think that is going to influence the future of the BBC's provision of services? And in particular, have you yet reached a view about BBC Three moving online?
Okay. Well, we have not received yet the final. We have not done the final review of BBC Three. So the moment we have, then we will publish it. It's a really difficult challenge. I think if you look at the statistics, it will show that group in public are watching less. They are certainly watching very differently. Although sometimes they view by appointment as sort of a Strictly or a sports occasion. Typically they eat or they watch on the go through devices that they have. I think that the idea of moving BBC Three and making it online in and of itself is good. We can come back to the review about the totality of that, but I think challenging the BBC executive and the production teams to think about what works well online, because it is different genre, I think is important. And I think that in the charter review, what I would expect is that we will get the feedback like you have from the younger audience. And that will feed into what we think we need to do as a universal broadcaster. And we are there to represent all members, or to address the needs and the wants of all licence fee payers and or members of the public. And so that is a group which I think we're not unusual in having that challenge. I think a lot of broadcasters have it, but I think it will require for the charter more focus on online, more focus on understanding how audience use and want to pick, and even catch-up television. I mean, catch-up television appears to be a way that the younger audience will use the BBC. and that again we have to take into account.
John Leach.
I was quite surprised by your response to Mr. Rotherham when you appeared to be saying we'll wait and see how much money we get allocated in the next round via the licence fee or any other form of funding, and then we'll decide what services we'll then be able to provide. Surely the BBC Trust should be trying to shape the debate and be saying what services you should be providing and trying to get the resources to provide those services.
I'm sorry if it was interpreted that way. What I did mean was, if it is set at a lower rate, then clearly, you have to cut your cloth depending on what you're given. That was my only point. We will absolutely be trying to frame the debate and say this is what the public are wanting. These are the sorts of programs. These are the genres. These are the types of investment we have to make in innovation or online to address what we are hearing the public wants. So absolutely, I'm just fixing to the realities of the world where you have a budget and ultimately there will be a settlement with a finite amount of money, and that was all I was saying. But it's not we're given a budget and then we decide. We absolutely will hope to frame the debate.
And how should the level of BBC funding be set, and for what period? If it was your decision how it was set, what would you do?
Well, my sense is that I think ideally it should be set for the bulk at least of the charter review period, and the charter review at least is open in terms of that window, but I think 10 years is a sensible amount of time. It gives you some creative freedom, some flexibility, and an ability to plan a little bit longer term. I think 5 is too short. I think 15 people might feel a bit uncomfortable. So I think 10 is about right. Within that, I think that the budget can be set, and you could have it as for the full 10 years, or you could say there'll be a review point somewhere between 5 and 10 years. To my mind, I think the more certainty you can give, then the more creative freedom that you can give to the organisation, and the more that the BBC could invest on behalf of the public in innovations. So I would say 10 years would be the right period of time. The other reason I think that's a sensible period is one of the key elements of the BBC is its independence. And I think to have that length of time allows it to have that independent voice, which again, speaking on behalf of the licence fee payer, is a critical part of the BBC.
Lord Burns suggested some sort of independent commission to advise the government on the level of the licence fee. Do you think something like that would help?
I think, the BBC Trust has at its heart the role of representing the interests of licence fee payers. So I think we will be looking to bring that into the discussions about the licence fee, and making sure that is very much founded in what kind of BBC do we want for the future, and what kind of BBC
So are you suggesting that the
audiences
BBC
and the
Trust
public
should have that role then? That should be the role of the BBC Trust.
I think the BBC Trust does have the role of representing and being the voice of the licence fee payer in this discussion.
Lord Burns was suggesting setting up a separate commission to give advice to the government. Do you feel that the BBC Trust is perfectly adequate to do that?
I think the BBC Trust has, as I said, has that role of representing the interests of licence fee payers and is able to do that. Lord Burns was making
with respect,
wider...
That's not really answering my question.
Well, Lord Burns was making a wider proposal at the time in a different context of a different governance structure. It wasn't just about the way that the licence fee settlement is decided.
You appear to be inferring that the BBC Trust can do that without it being necessary to have another body that might advise.
I don't think you need another body as well as the BBC Trust, no.
Okay. And in terms of the actual licence fee payers themselves, how should they be involved in the process? Because there's There have been many polls where licence fee payers have said that the licence fee should be lower, but at the same time there are others that have said that the licence fee is the best vehicle of funding the BBC. But also there's always going to be the situation where they will want more for less. So how should the licence fee payers themselves be involved in the process about the decision-making process for the licence fee?
Well, I think, as I said, I think the whole process of charter review and licence fee needs to be open and needs to take account of licence fee payers' views and interests. So I think that starts with what kind of BBC do people want, what are people's expectations of the BBC, and then how do you pay for it? I think you need to take account of all of those things and take account of licence fee payers' views all the way through.
But do you think the licence fee payers feel that the trust actually represents their views? Or do you think that the licence fee payers think that the trust represents the trust's views?
Well, the trust, we are open and transparent about how we come to our views, the evidence that we base it on. We go out to consultation in relation to key decisions and key views that we make. We will do the same around charter review. So I think...
I wouldn't have thought licensing payers, not that many licensing, know what the BBC Trust is. It doesn't mean to say that we don't represent their interests. It doesn't mean to say that we don't do extensive amount of research to understand their views, but
if that's the case, though, how do you go about ensuring that that licence fee payers do know that you're there to represent their views?
Well, we publicise our service reviews on the television, on the radio. We invite people to make submissions to us.
But you've admitted that you think most licence fee payers probably don't realise that you're there to represent their views.
I think because we're still a relative, we're 8 years old, and that's still in, to the time it takes that to sort of to get into the public consciousness. BBC Trust, BBC. I'm not sure people know what the difference is.
But on that basis, if the trust has not quite got into the public consciousness yet, even if it does at some point in the future, can it really play the role of giving the views of the licence fee payers into the charter renewal process and cost of the BBC?
I think we can demonstrate by asking the licence fee payers what they think about the licence fee, what they think about the BBC, what they think about the services. This is work we do all the time. We have a very clear sense of licence fee payers' expectations. We've got a clear sense of where the BBC's fallen short in terms of licence fee payers. We talked a little bit about the younger audience are now viewing more on tablets. They're viewing less. They're less loyal than the older audience. These are all big challenges for the BBC that we're incredibly well aware of because we do a great deal of research. We talk to a great many licence fee payers in our work. So I don't think we don't have a sense of what the issues are.
I think we can do that role. I think we have to do that role. That's our job. And therefore, if I mean, everybody knows who the BBC is, and I think that's the important thing. I think it's the outreach to make sure you get we get the views of the public, to make sure that the research is very open, that people realise what the data says. And I think absolutely we can play that role in terms of being the voice of the licence fee payer. But the onus is on us to make sure that the public are aware of the process to be part of the consultation. The onus is on us to make sure that we fully, properly show those views and share those views with the rest of the public in reaching that conclusion. So to answer your question, I think we can, and that's absolutely what our role is to do, and that's what we are aiming to do. And if we need to put more impetus in the outreach, that's what we'll do.
Just one last question. The vast bulk of the TV licence fee goes towards the BBC. Does the Trust view the TV licence fee as the BBC's licence fee, or is it just part of the TV licence fee? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of the BBC retaining the vast bulk of the licence fee?
I mean, I think if you asked in the public, they would think that the TV licence fee was the BBC licence fee. The benefits, I think, are also clear. That there is a certain amount, an amount that can be ring-fenced, and then you and this select committee, the public, can hold the trust and the executive accountable for the spend of that money. So I think there is something very beneficial about being clear about what the sum of money, and it gives you creative freedom, gives you that independence, which again the public say that they want. It allows you to invest on longer term issues. So I think most of the public, I think if the evidence I've seen is they think it's part of, they think it is the BBC licence, and I think there are a lot of advantages for ring fencing it on that basis.
Any disadvantages?
I think the benefits are very strong.
Ben Bradshaw.
Messrs Zeff and Lidderment, you will have read the evidence that's been given to this committee as part of our inquiry and know that the almost unanimous view is that the BBC Trust should be abolished. Would it not have been a little bit more diplomatic of you to have come to this committee with a little bit more humility about the Trust's own role in response to the question from Mr Leach? Perfectly reasonable suggestion that's also been presented to this committee that it might be a good idea to have an independent commission to help get through this next charter process. You seem to want to own more of it yourself than happened at the last charter review, in spite of all the problems that the Trust has been through and in spite of the overwhelming view that the Trust is busted. So, I mean, please, you have a chance to get out of the hole you're digging yourselves into, and I'm going to give you that opportunity now.
Shall I start? I mean, of course, at the last charter review, the Trust didn't exist. So under the governance structure that we have now, the Trust is the body that is separate from the BBC management and has at the core of its role to represent the interests of licence fee payers, as I said, and I think it is able to do that. There will be a debate in the Charter Review about the governance for the future of the BBC. I think there have been things and features of the current governance structure that have been improved as we've gone along, and there will no doubt be further improvements that we can make to the governance structure. But I think that as we are set up, the BBC Trust is the right body and is able to play that role.
You seem to want to have a death wish.
We are coming back to governance shortly. Probably great.
I don't think there's very much point, Mr Chairman.
Philip Davis.
Just before I come on back to the licence for a second, I just wondered, Mr Lidderman, your sort of extraordinary statement that nobody really knows about the BBC Trust, and that the reason you gave, if I heard you correctly, was because it's only been in existence for 8 years. I just wondered how long you expected it to be in existence for before people did realise its existence.
The point I was trying to make was that the phrase BBC Trust is not necessarily in the audience's uppermost in their mind when they're reflecting the BBC. They know the BBC. That's the only point I was trying to make.
So it'll never know the BBC Trust is basically what you're trying to say?
I'm not sure. I think what matters is that is that licence fee payers care deeply about the BBC, and they recognise the value it brings to Great Britain, to their own lives. I think that's what's important.
Mrs Fairhead, I was rather alarmed at your initial answer to Conor Burns's question when he asked you what your initial reactions were. And if I might be allowed to sort of paraphrase what you said, it seemed to be along the lines of that your initial reactions were that you were starting from a starting point of how wonderful it was, and what's really struck you is how even more wonderful it was than you thought it was when you first started. Have you sort of gone native in record time?
Definitely not. I do think you have to recognise good quality programming where it exists, and I think that there has been a renewed focus on, on creativity, distinctiveness, and quality programming, and I am just recognising the fact, which is, broadly recognised by the public, that the BBC is a producer of good quality programmes. That was my point. My other point was about efficiency, and as you know, I think that to continue to earn the public trust, the BBC has to be efficient in the way that it runs itself, in the way that it operates. I haven't been in 2 weeks yet, and therefore, I haven't got a fully fledged view of that. But all I was saying was that I was pleased that there was this sense of a culture building around that relentless focus on efficiency. So there is no company or organisation in the world that cannot improve. So if you think that was what I was saying, then it was not what I was saying. I think it's incumbent on us to make it even better in terms of quality, making sure that focus on efficiency is there and that it's well run, and to making sure that the standards that the public expect of the BBC are upheld. So no, I don't think I've gone native. I don't intend ever to go native. I'm very clear about the role that the Trust has on both representing the licence fee payer, which I think we do in terms of quality, independence, impartiality, value. I think I'm also very clear in the role that we have as regulator, and where we think there has been a mistake or a wrong turn, we will clearly say so. And there is also a governance, so the element which will be to hold the executive accountable. All I was saying was that I recognise the quality. I've been impressed by the quality programming I've seen, and I've been impressed by the sense of a growing culture of focus on efficiency. But in terms of going native, no.
It's just that when people come from afresh to a new organisation and they're asked what strikes them about an organisation, normally people say, what struck me is that these things are really good, but that these things really, I don't really understand, or they don't make any sense, or they need to do a lot better. And I was just struck that your answer to Conor Byrne's question only focused on the former and didn't focus on the latter. I found that a rather troubling...
I would hope you wouldn't be troubled by that. I mean, I'm very clear of my role is in governance and to hold accountable, and I am sure that there will be a whole host of things that I and the Trust think can be improved, and we will do everything that we have in our power and our ability to change that. I think that what you have to aim off for is the fact that I've been in the role for less than 2 weeks.
Just before moving forward, I just wondered also whether or not you intended to revisit anything from the past, whether you thought there was any unfinished business from the past, from your predecessor. And I mean, I'm not. That's an open question in essence, but just as an illustration, for example, the Pollard review, which where a huge amount of money was spent, and then Nick Pollard admitted that he excluded some evidence from it, and I just wondered whether or not all of those things, as far as you were concerned, were now in the past, or whether you intended to revisit some of the mistakes that were seen to be made by your predecessor.
I think that on the whole, things that have been in the past and have been closed out by the Trust should only be revisited if new and material evidence is brought forward that would justify revisiting that. So I think that is, so that would be sort of my basic principle going in. But if new and material evidence, facts were brought to light, which would mean that should happen, then of course we would review. I would review, and the Trust would review whether or not we needed to open. I think the important thing for any organisation, though, is certainty. And on the whole, I would think that the important thing is to learn the lessons of what happens and make sure they don't happen again. So the focus, I think, should primarily be on lessons learned and looking forward. But clearly, if anything material was ever brought to light that would question the legitimacy of a decision, then you would have to look into that and decide what action to take.
Was the evidence that Nick Pollard being recorded saying that he'd actually excluded crucial evidence, is that not new evidence? Do you not consider that to be new evidence, or that should have been considered or not? I'm just trying to clarify whether that's
well,
new
in terms of that specific one, that there have been some letters received in the last couple of days which have made some assertions which we'll look into. In terms of the particular facts that were raised at that time, my understanding was that the Trust looked into that, reviewed it, and decided to not to change the report. But clearly, I've received these 2 letters. I will do like I would with any decision and say, is anything material in that that would require any change?
On the licence fee, do you consider that it represents value for money and commands the support of the public?
I think that in terms of the licence fee as a mechanism, I think broadly yes. If you look at the research that we have done, the public is broadly in favour of a licence fee. In fact, the trend is that they're probably more supportive rather than less of paying with the licence fee arrangement. And I think that is because of the independence it gives and that sense of impartiality, which I think is critically important. In terms of value for money, clearly £145.50 is a large amount of money to a number of people in this country, and it has to be made sure that it is value for money. And I think the only way that, but I think broadly people would say yes. Broadly, the feedback is that they believe in the BBC and they think it is good value for money. But that is something that when we go through the charter review process, it's fixed now until the end of this charter, and it will be part of the consultation, but it will have to go in the order of what is it that you want the BBC to be, and then going back to the public and saying, this is what you said to us that you want, this is how much it would cost, and this would be the implications for the licence fee. So I think we have to do both of those, both what the public want, how much it would cost, and are they prepared to fund that.
You see, if it represents such wonderful value for money, this is a bit I've never quite understood. If it's such great value for money, what has the BBC to fear from going to a subscription model? Because, of course, if it was such wonderful value for money and it just went to a voluntary subscription level, presumably everyone would be queuing up down the streets to pay it because it represents such wonderful value for money. Is the sort of reluctance to go down a subscription model a sort of a realisation that's being hidden that actually maybe it doesn't represent such wonderful value for money after all?
Not at all. I think the BBC serves a broad variety of public purposes, which is, I think, what that has a risk of missing. I think the other, and I've seen evidence to this committee which I would agree with, which is other models potentially will change the nature of the programming and the nature of satisfying those public purposes, and not in a positive way. So I think that particularly it's about independence and impartiality and the universality of the model. So to your point, if you go down the route that you're suggesting, you may find that if you want to maximise your revenues, you put on a certain number of these sorts of programmes and you don't address whole sections of the community. Our role is to be a universal service, and the licence fee model, my strong going in assumption, as I said when I was interviewed in the pre-appointment meeting, was that it's good. The public broadly support it. It's not a problem that needs to be fixed. I think that clearly we should have the debate But my going assumption is it's good, it's worked very effectively. Let's look at the alternatives and let's see what the implications are.
But if that's the case, why does the BBC need the criminal law to force people to pay for it if it's such a popular mechanism and if it's such a great value for money? Surely it shouldn't need the criminal law to back it up. And not only does it have the criminal law to back it up, in 2012 the TV licensing people brought 181,000 prosecutions and secured over 155,000 convictions for people who haven't paid the licence fee. So how do you square that evidence with your assertion that the system commands widespread support and is great value for money?
Well, I mean, as I said before, I mean, in an ideal world, people would pay if they watch or use or listen to the BBC, and nobody would need to. And in an ideal world, nobody would ever be put in prison for failure to pay the fine associated. The other thing I would say is 95% of the population do pay, and for those people, effectively, they're subsidising those who choose to use the BBC, but who choose not to pay. And so, is it fair that others should be subsidising what is a universal fee? So that's one element. On the decriminalisation itself, I think that the terms of reference of the review have been announced, as you'll be aware, by the Secretary of State this morning of the review. I think it's entirely appropriate all the facts are gathered about what the options are in terms of civil penalties instead of criminal penalties. And I think once those facts are established, we'll be in a better situation, the government will be in a better situation to decide is that the appropriate route to go down with civil penalties rather than criminal. But I think the review is about, as I understand it, collecting the facts to be able to make a judgment on that, which I think is obviously within the Secretary of State's power to do so. And I
will you be submitting evidence?
I'm sorry?
Will you be submitting evidence to the review?
I believe we will, yes.
And will you be arguing for the continuation of criminalisation of licence fee?
I think we'll be looking very carefully, as the Chairman said, at the evidence around the options. I think we will want to, one of the things that we will want to take into account very carefully as we look at that, and which is clearly part of the terms of reference, is the impact on licence fee payers, the impact on BBC income, and the effectiveness of any different system. So I think we'd be looking very carefully at that before drawing conclusions, but we'll certainly want to submit evidence and views.
And do you think it's appropriate that the BBC uses the powers under the Regulation of the Investigatory Powers Act to chase people who are failing to pay the licence fee? This is a piece of legislation which was designed for tackling serious organised crime and terrorism.
I think the BBC, obviously in TV licensing, will use the proper powers that it has. I think if there are particular concerns or complaints that things are happening that are either inappropriate or shouldn't be happening within the law, then there is a system for managing those complaints.
So you think it's fine to use those powers?
I'm not familiar with the specific powers that you're referring to. If there's a particular concern or complaint,
well, the
then
BBC have so far
but
admitted that they do use RIPA powers, but have not said how.
Well, as I said, I think it's right for TV licensing to use the appropriate range of powers that are available to them. And I think if there are concerns or complaints that they are doing things that are inappropriate, then we have processes for dealing with that. We can. Yes.
I've got Angie quickly.
Thank you. Just to take you back briefly to the issue around subscription television, have you done any research, or can you see a possibility in the BBC offering particular premium subscription services? And not, you'd obviously the bulk of your programme would still be delivered call free to air as now, but there might be an opportunity for the BBC, offering particular niche type programmes to offer that on a subscription basis, which would, of course, alleviate some of the pressure on the licence fee payer. Is that something that you've thought about or looked into?
I think that would be an intelligent way to look forward in terms of the charter review. I think there are going to be issues with that. If you saw, you will have. I mean, I read the Director General's session feedback to the Select Committee in terms of some of the logistical issues that might have. But I think that it's important to say that the BBC should be trying to use sources of funding to make sure that the best value for money is possible. So the licence fee is not the only source of funding, as you know, from BBC. The BBC Worldwide does bring some money in to the BBC and contribute, and does raise the profile and have that outreach and being the UK's place in the world. I think we have to concentrate on that as well. Obviously within state aid and commercial issues. And I think we should be looking at what are other ways where we can help make the licence fee the best possible value for money.
But it would allow you to offer some more specialised niche programming which appeals to one section of your audience, if not to all sections, and it would therefore be a way of funding that without actually making everybody pay for something that they don't particularly want to watch.
And as I said, I think the Charter Review should look at all sources of income that we could use and then decide. The core of the answer I was addressing was is the licence fee a sensible model as the core? But I think there are other sources of funding that we should be looking at with a view of making sure we have the funding to make quality programmes, stay impartial, but also give the best value for money.
Are you looking into any of this? I mean, are you actually actively examining some of these other options?
We absolutely will be as part of the Charter Review, not now, because right now, as you know, it's fixed.
Okay, thank you.
John, quickly.
Just Mr. Zeff, in relation to the RIPA legislation, do you not think it would be much easier to justify using powers under RIPA if the BBC actually admitted which powers under the legislation were being used, because then it would be much easier for people to make a judgment about whether or not it was appropriate to use those powers?
I don't think I can honestly add to the answers I've already given around that. As I said, I think it's appropriate for TV licensing to use the range of legal powers that are available to it. There is a process and a system for handling complaints if there are concerns about the approach or about specific cases of how they've pursued people. And as I think I've said, we'll look into that specific issue in the context of considering the review that's underway.
Transparency is quite important then?
I think in broad terms, sort of appropriate transparency is important, but I don't know the specifics of the issue you're raising, so I think that's something that we'll need to look into.
We need to move on to governance. Just before I do, one last question. The commercial broadcasters are making a strong pitch that they should receive payment from satellite and cable operators for the provision of their content. Is that something that you agree with?
Do you have a view, David?
Well, I think it isn't. I think the requirement, the universality as the core of the BBC, was the reason why, way back, the BBC was the first broadcaster to agree a transmission arrangement with Sky. So I think that issue of universality has got to be weighed very carefully. But it's not something that I have any particular insights on.
I mean, this was raised by Mark Thompson originally in McTaggart at the time when the BBC was paying the broadcasters,
That's right.
or the satellite and cable operators. Now you've got a sort of gentleman's agreement that neither of you charge each other, but you'll be aware that ITV and Channel 4 are pushing very hard to open up the question of what's called retransmission fees, although not everybody accepts that's an accurate definition. Is the BBC not going to enter that argument?
I think it's something the BBC will have to think about very carefully.
I understand the government is going to consult on this issue, so we'll look forward to engaging in that. So I think, as David says, the universality of BBC services is clearly important. Against that, one can see I think why there would be an argument for saying that commercial platforms that are carrying services and are arguably getting a commercial benefit from doing that, why there may be arguments why they should pay. But I think that's something that we need to look into in the context of the consultation that I understand the government is going to conduct on this.
Okay. Paul Farrell.
Thank you, Chair. Just moving on to governance. David, you've been a trustee throughout, and the BBC had a couple of torrid years.
Yeah.
How well do you think the BBC Trust acquitted itself in those torrid times in terms of its own credibility?
Well, clearly not very well, in that there is a widespread view in the press and elsewhere that the BBC Trust model is not fit for purpose. Whether that's fair is a separate issue. And I do think that it's very clear, looking back over the past 8 years and living through those very difficult moments, that there was a kind of fault line in the way the trust was set up that I think we only properly came to grips with quite recently, and that was getting granular and very specific about the respective responsibilities of the trust and the management vis-a-vis the role of the non-executive directors on the management board. Once the trust was set up as a more separate body, if you like, than the governors had been, it was felt that the executive board should more closely resemble that of a private company, and there should be non-executive directors to assist the management in running the BBC. And I think that through the precise role of those non-executive directors in relation to good governance, value for money, and so on, I think wasn't clear enough. I think that's been changed, and I think now it is clear. So we had situations where you saw different arms of the BBC, I think in this committee or other committees in the House, taking different positions, and I think that's clearly not in the interest of the BBC. It isn't good governance, but I think it has been dealt with. And I think the sadness of all of that, there's no point in denying it's happened, is that there's a great deal of good work that the Trust has done, a lot of which wasn't done before we existed. It wasn't done by the governors around the creation of the service licenses, the transparency with the commercial sector of what the BBC is there to do, what each service is there to do, being able to respond to complaints from the commercial sector around, for example, undue prominence on Radio 2, or around apparently sponsorship on Spotify, those kind of things, which were dealt with, and changes were made as a result of them. Changes to the service licence where it was felt that the BBC was overstepping the mark. These are all good things to keep the BBC focused on its public purposes, and to keep clarity with its role versus that of the commercial marketplace.
Let's take one example of one of the things that happened that's where you might have include it in where the trust didn't play things very well, nor even non-executive directors. Let's take the issue of excessive severance payments.
Yeah.
On the one hand, the Director General can say, this is my operational responsibility. But on the other hand, that sort of, those continued stories have a profound effect on the reputation of the BBC. So what is the Trust's role in holding the Director General and the Board to account in circumstances like that?
Well, I think the great tragedy of the severance row, did the BBC's reputation no good at all, was that it was born out of a very good piece of work the Trust had done about reducing the cost of the BBC executive and reducing the number of senior managers at the BBC, to delivering annualised savings in excess of £25 million a year. In a sense, the severance row was as much about executive pay as about severance. Most of the people who were paid severance were paid their contractual terms, but because they were highly paid individuals, they got big severance packages. I accept there were some cases where severance packages were in excess of their contractual arrangements. But it's worth stating that, because in a sort of public money kind of way, it has disguised some very good work in terms of keeping the cost of the BBC under control and actively reducing the cost of senior management. I think in a situation like that, it is right for the BBC Trust to be aware and approve the policy around BBC remuneration, but it is for the BBC management to put those policies into action and to propose those policies, and it is for the BBC management to be held account if they deviate from them.
And how on the ball was the Trust in terms of knowing what was going on? How well was the Trust supported by the BBC Trust unit?
Well, I think pretty well supported by the Trust unit. There was the thing about the severance situation was that we were very focused on, and it was a real challenge to challenge at the time, executive board who did not feel that executive pay was too high and the BBC executive salaries were too high. We took the opposite view. We were listening to the public, and we felt very strongly that they should. Now, so the Trust was set about trying to persuade initially the management, and eventually we did, that they should cut the executive pay. So our focus was on executive pay and reducing the cost to the licence fee so that more money went into programming. It wasn't on severance per se.
Okay, let's move on to more recent times. What role did you, as a trustee, play in the appointment of the new Director General?
Tony Hall?
Yes.
I was consulted. Clearly, we were in a difficult situation with the resignation of George Entwistle. The BBC had a very good acting Director General, and the feeling was we needed to move quickly to put a permanent appointment in place that could bring some stability to the organisation, and the name of Tony Hall was brought to the Trust, and we all felt that it was an excellent idea.
Without any outside influence?
I think because at the time there was a serious issue, and the BBC was going through a very difficult time. It lost its Director General, and something needs to be done quickly. And I think in those circumstances, and there were exceptional circumstances, I think that was appropriate. I absolutely accept, under normal circumstances, a proper appointments procedure should have taken place.
Okay, I asked that question because some people have been quite critical of some of the appointments that Tony made in a fairly swift fashion, again without outside advertisement.
Yeah.
When that thing takes place, in the BBC, what role is there for the Trust and trustees to make sure that actually senior appointments are advertised?
Well, I think that's what we would like to see. I think one has to be, to a degree, pragmatic, because we have an overriding obligation for the BBC to be efficiently run, well run, and for it to continue to deliver the services to the very high quality that the public expect. In those circumstances, for the BBC Trust to be dictating to the Director General who he should and should not hire, I think would be wrong. In many cases, Tony hired through a competitive process. In one or two, he were people that he particularly wanted, that he believed would add real strength to his management team. And I think in those circumstances, having hired the guy, you're back your chief executive.
You've said that following the governance review, things are much clearer now.
Yes.
I wasn't the only one to express surprise. I think Rona, when she was interviewed before the appointment, expressed some surprise, or agreed with the surprise, that a big announcement such as Tony Hall's announcement on production could be made without the trust being consulted first, putting the trust in the position afterwards to, at the end of the day, say yay or nay, and potentially setting up a back me or sack me position.
I didn't see it that way. Actually, Rona referred earlier on to the imminent WOC review. We're obliged through the agreement to review the WOC every 2 years, and we've done that every 2 years, and it's been a very strong, impressive story. We took the view as trustees that we ought to, that this time, rather than just look at the WOC, we should take a broader view, particularly with Charter Review on the horizon, at the whole production sector and how the BBC acquires its programmes, commissions its programme, produces its programme. So we, the trust, had determined that we wanted to look at the whole sector, not just the WOC, but BBC in-house production, the way the independent sector was developing. There were clearly significant changes going on there. It was in that context that Tony Hall announced his view of how he wanted to take forward production. And I think that those two things are entirely synchronous, and I think we are going to do our review. We will look at BBC in-house production as we will look at developments in the independent sector, or my colleagues will, because I'll have finished, and take a view as to what we believe is in the best interests of the best programmes, the best quality for licence fee payers. So I don't quite accept that Tony Hall announcing that he was going to look at introducing a sort of open market for programmes. I didn't feel in any sense that I was being...
You didn't feel left out at all?
No, I didn't feel I was being wrong-footed. I've argued long and hard for creative competition, and the more competition, the better. I think the BBC should have nothing to fear from competing with everyone else. And if its programme makers are good enough, my own personal view is that they should be free to make programmes elsewhere. In the BBC, imagine there's a huge captive pile of great ideas that haven't got on the air because another part of the BBC didn't want to make them. Why shouldn't the BBC be able to sell those to other people? So on a personal level, I was entirely sympathetic with that thinking. However, it came about after we had determined that we were going to review the whole production thing, and Tony knew this was taking place. So I think he wanted to put his cards on the table, and it will feed into our review.
So you're quite happy with, irrespective of your sympathy for an announcement or not, if you can divorce your sympathy from it, you're quite happy to have a situation where you've got, as a trust, these protocols, but they don't address at all the role of the trust in being informed and making an announcement, so that it looks like, it does look a bit more as if you're a bit more... coordinated is probably the wrong word, but working together while still the BBC still being accountable to you.
I think we should work together, but equally we should. We have to let the BBC managers manage. We have to enable them to. They're running a big organisation, a very dynamic market, and. I don't think we should be second-guessing everything they're doing. What we should be doing is setting and agreeing the overall strategy for the organisation. We're clear that what the BBC does must fulfil the public purposes laid down by the Charter. So there's some sort of bottom-line stuff, if you like, the top-level stuff, where we need to be involved and we need to know what's going on. One of the things that is at the centre of what we care about most is that the public deserve the very best from the BBC. If the Director General makes a proposal about changing how BBC production might change, and that is in the interest of serving the licence fee better, why wouldn't I welcome it?
Okay, I've just got one last question on governance, Chair, but before I do that, I've got just... You're going through at the moment a public value testing process with respect to the decision on BBC Three.
We will be doing it.
You will be doing.
Well, it hasn't started.
Yeah. Well, I thought Tony had announced that in March.
Well, he announced his intention, subject to trust approval, his proposal to remove BBC Three as a normal channel and put it online. that has to go through a public value test, and we said, right, we await the detailed proposals. He made the announcement in March because it was known to only a tiny number of people at the BBC, and my understanding is that the proposal is imminent.
So he's made the announcement in March, but nothing's happened since?
What's happened since is he's got people working in the detail of the proposal.
Oh, so he's made the announcement without having the detail?
No, what he did was, look, what he did, he didn't announce, he said, this is my intention is to do this. In other words, I have been persuaded, I am persuaded by the strategic and financial and every other arguments that this is in the best interest of the BBC. I recognise that in order to make this happen, I need to get approval from the governing body of the BBC Trust. In order that they can make a decision, they need great detail, because they need to understand exactly how this is going to work. They need to understand in great detail the impact it may or may not have on the market, because we need to be able to conduct a public value test. So until we get the detail, we can't do the public value test. I don't think that's a...
You're a very respected television executive in the independent sector as well. And one of the complaints that we have, be it on BBC Three, be it on BBC 1+1,
Yeah.
be it on BBC Production, where the BBC Production is potentially going to compete in the outside market, and other announcements that the BBC makes, that they instill a great deal of uncertainty in the outside world. And that uncertainty is certainly not dispelled by months and months and months of waiting for detail.
Well, there will, but we will publish what BBC sent to us, the detailed proposal. We will publish that. We will then do our work, and the work allows everybody to come in and say, what about this, what about that? It's an entirely open process. So those people who have concerns about BBC Three and think that it's the wrong thing to do will have the opportunity to make their arguments through that process. So I don't think that anyone's got anything to fear from that. No one's going to do a backdoor deal around
so
BBC
open
Three.
that your answer that nothing's happened is news to me.
Well,
I don't. I mean, the formal public value test has not started because, as David said, the trust is awaiting the very detailed proposal that we need in order to run the kind of detailed scrutiny for Ofcom to do the market impact assessment, for us to run the sort of consultation that we need to. I don't think that is the same at all as saying nothing has happened.
Right.
I will remove it.
Just before we do, can I ask, are you going to have the same process, some kind of public value test, for the proposal to have a video component of Radio 1?
That is something that the Trust is looking at the moment, and will announce a decision on that shortly.
As to whether or not it should happen, or as to whether or not you're going to have a public value test?
As to how we're going to proceed with it, what we need to do with that proposal is to consider whether or not that amounts to a significant change which triggers, under the Charter and agreements, the public value test process. So
and that's
the
entirely
process
a
that
matter
we're
for
going
you,
to.
or do you take advice from Ofcom?
We take advice from Ofcom as part of that process.
Right, so you have asked Ofcom to advise.
We've asked Ofcom to advise us.
But there is a significance test that is mandated, and if it hits that test, then it goes to full PBT. I think there will be an issue to discuss in the Charter review, because as I understand it, it's either full PBT, very, very expensive, or very small pieces of work. There's not the flexibility to do something in the middle. So I think that will be something that we'll raise in the Charter process.
Final question, I promise you, Chairman. Again, David, Lord Burns previously recommended that the BBC should have one unitary board, and there should be a separate public service broadcasting commission set up as a regulator, an off-beeb, as it were. Mm-hmm. You contributed a chapter in a book earlier this year where I think, I've got the quote, where you had a fear that actually might lead to a form of light touch regulation, rather than being an improvement. So could you
yeah, sure.
outline your thinking behind that?
I feel very, very strongly that the BBC is a major intervention. It's not just a major intervention, it's part of the fabric of our lives in this country. And It's 3.75 billion quid a year. It's a very serious thing. Most people consume a bit of the BBC every day. It's a very important part of our democracy, part of our culture. That means it's very important. And I think you need a body to protect the public interest in this wonderful institution, this wonderful British creation. I don't think that can be the management board. I don't think that can be the board of the company, even with the most talented non-executive directors and a talented non-executive chairman, a sort of PLC model board. I think that is not enough for an organisation that is funded by the licence fee, that spends all of that money, that delivers all those services to the public, that plays such a central part in our lives. So whatever emerges from the Charter Review, what I argued in that chapter was that there should be, whoever manages the BBC, there should be an entity that protects the public value in the BBC. Whatever that's called, whether it's called the BBC Trust or something off BEEB, or indeed whatever. What I was fearful of was I hear some people argue, let's have a PLC-style board, non-exec chair, non-executive directors and so on, with the appropriate balance, and let Ofcom do the regulating. They're the regulators. That I think it would be a mistake. I think light touch regulation, and at the end of the day Ofcom prides itself on being minimum standards, light touch regulation, able to flex according to changes in the marketplace for the commercial sector. I think that wouldn't be appropriate for the BBC. The BBC is too important.
If that broadcasting public sector for the Commission, as recommended by Lord Burns, was set up as an off-BEEB simply because Ofcom didn't want to, or it wasn't felt appropriate that Ofcom was there, but it was essentially the same function. That whatever the failings of the trust so far in some of the torrid times, are you saying that to have that model and get rid of the intimate connection between the trust and the BBC would be a retrograde step?
No, I'm saying that I'm of the view that that the trust has its role and the management has its role, and we should respect each other's role. Of course, we have to understand each other, but my obligation to the public, to the licence fee papers, and to the institution, but not to the management of the BBC. But it would be silly to have a combative relationship with them. So I'm for. The last thing the BBC needs, I put in that article, is light touch regulation. It's too important for this country. It is a big beast, and it's operating in markets. So part of its instinct is to be competitive, and that's a good thing. But it does mean from time to time it isn't always as focused on its public purposes or about being distinctive as it needs to be. And you need a body that kind of keeps it in line. I think that, don't get me wrong, not to tell it what to do, but to give the appropriate tension between its public values and the efficiency and competitiveness of the entity itself. And we want it to be efficient, we want it to be competitive, we want it to be well run, but we want it to be focused on the public purposes, on the public values.
I've got one final short question before the Secretary of State.
From a very short question, but I think a very important one. We talked about the debate on BBC production and its future, and you said it was open and transparent. There is a feeling, particularly amongst many of the small independent production companies, that it isn't open and transparent, and that the BBC perhaps isn't as transparent in terms of its figures, what production costs within the BBC, what costs are included within those figures, and they're very worried that we could end up, if this isn't managed in an open and transparent way, with a significant market distortion. I think my final question is to you, Rona, and that is, can we have your assurance today that as the Trust looks at this issue, it will engage productively with the private sector to make sure that they have the figures from the BBC, obviously not commercially sensitive ones, but the figures they feel they need to ensure that this process doesn't result in a market distortion?
I am clear that on the management is only working that up now, and it's one of those ideas that sounds great in principle, but the devil really is in the detail here, and it's in that commercial detail that you talked about. I think that there's almost the the management need to be clear about what it is that they are proposing for us to be able to give any sense of clarity to those independents. But I do think that will be part of the process. In terms of, I think there may be a debate about what numbers competitively sensitive and not. That will probably be where the arguments are made. But our role in the trust will be to get that information and to have a consultation that we think gives enough information for the independents to feel, and that we think that should be enough for them to make sensible business decisions on. I can't sit here now and say that I can guarantee that all numbers they want will be given. But I can say we'll listen to what the management is proposing. We'll then, on that basis, engage, and we will do so in a way which has sufficient transparency to allow some element of certainty to be brought back into that process.
And you recognise the concern as legitimate?
I think this the aim is good. The concerns are legitimate in terms of what are the commercial impacts of that, and that absolutely is at the heart of this discussion.
And no one should be allowed to abuse any kind of weight in the marketplace, and there are fair trading issues and the fair trading infrastructure around that to protect that. But I think it's a understandable concern.
Thank you.
Right. Those are all the questions we have. Can I thank you very much?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Second part of this morning's session, and as our final witness in this inquiry, can I welcome the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Tracy Crouch.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, you've been quite clear that the formal BBC Charter review process should wait until after the election. Could you explain why you've come to that conclusion?
Yes, I can. First of all, maybe, Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, just to make a couple of opening remarks before I turn to the question. First of all, thank you for inviting me to give evidence. Thank you for carrying out this inquiry. I think that once it's complete, it will be a very valuable input to the Charter review process when it starts. Now, turning to the Charter review process itself, the reason I decided to postpone it until effectively June 2015, so after the next general election, is that I felt if it starts earlier, so before that election, that it might get unnecessarily too politicised. So it might become too bogged down in sort of day-to-day politics and issues that could distort the process in some way.
But the previous Charter review spanned an election period, and I don't think anybody's ever suggested that happened in those circumstances.
The previous Charter review, as I understand it, took about 3 years. And also I felt, looking at that, and I looked at it carefully, was that it's not necessary to have a 3-year period. I think that if the process starts as currently planned, so let's assume June 2015, that there is enough time to go through all the issues, the key issues that would need to be carefully looked at to come to a conclusion, and then to change the Charter as appropriate. So I feel there's enough time. There are, I think, things that can be done and that I have initiated already, and others for that matter, that I think will feed in nicely into that process. So, for example, there is the inquiry that your committee itself is carrying out. I've also started an independent review of decriminalisation of the licence fee, which will also report right after the election, and I think that can feed into the Charter review. And there is also an inquiry going on by the Ofcom on the PSB sector generally, one of their sort of reviews that they carry out, I think, every 5 years. And that's planned to finish, I think, in summer 2015, and I think that can feed into the process too.
Yeah, just your comments on the previous charter review suggest that you thought that 3 years were too long. What did they do that you won't be doing now, or do you just think that they did things under the previous review that you can do just a lot quicker?
Yeah, I just think I haven't come across anything that I think suggests to me that 3 years is required, and I think the time that will be left sort of after the election is enough to go through all the issues, which will clearly be many issues, but things like future funding model, sustainability of whatever model is decided on, governance issues, and there are many. I think there will be enough time, and I think the fact that some of the work that will feed into that has already started, with some of the examples that I've given, I think will help to ensure that the time that will be available for that will be enough.
Will you consider appointing an independent advisory panel to provide input in the way that Lord Burns did during the last charter review?
I would consider it, but I haven't made any decision on who would form the panel.
And what about, are you anticipating publishing any green or white papers with proposals for the future of the BBC, as per the previous review?
Yeah, not until the charter review process starts. I'm not anticipating publishing anything.
So what work and areas of research do you think do need to take place in order to inform the process this time around?
Well,
Other than, obviously, the excellent work of this committee.
Yeah, well, that's important input. But the other ones I'd highlight is the decriminalisation review, because I think that will have an impact, whatever the outcome of that, could have an impact on future funding and sustainability of funding. The Ofcom review, because that's looking more broadly across the PSB sector, but obviously the BBC being a key part of that, I think will also have an impact, and those recommendations from Ofcom, whatever they are at the time, will be important. So I think there's enough work going on out there that will feed into that. Obviously there's many other stakeholders out there, not least the BBC itself, that will, I'm sure, have already started work and looking forward to the charter review. So I think given that everyone knows when the charter review will start, I think that in itself helps to ensure that it will be enough time to carry out the review.
Some might say that the having such a short period of time to decide the next charter will actually benefit the government more than the BBC and the licence fee payer. What would you say to that?
No, I don't see that. I can't see how it would benefit the government
So
today.
hasty decisions that will be made by yourself post 2015, you don't think would have any negative impact on the BBC or indeed the...
Well, first of all, I hope I'm there post in 2015. But whoever forms the government at that time, and certainly is anyone sitting in my seat at that time, I think that they will find the time that they have available for the setting of the new charter, agreeing everything with the stakeholders and finally putting that policy forward. I think they'll finally have enough time.
Can I just ask you to give a sort of general view as to how you see the BBC? Do you think it does too much, too little? Does it do the right things, the wrong things? What's your sort of general attitude towards the BBC?
Well, yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think first of all, I'd start by saying, like most people, I admire a lot of what the BBC does. If you look at a lot of its output, whether it's TV, it's radio, it's online, it is much of it is your high quality output. If you look at viewing figures, I think around the average person watches around 18.5 hours a week of BBC output, more than most of its competitors. It's an institution that's respected in many ways, not just at home, but just last week, for example, I was travelling in India, and a number of people, although I wasn't talking about the BBC, people knowing that it's one of the areas that I sort of oversee, they'd bring it up and in a positive way about something that Britain should be proud of. Having said that, I think that it should rightly, obviously, be accountable completely to the licence fee payers. And that it's been very tested over the last few years. It's had very significant challenges, and I think there's a bit of a question mark over how accountable it has really been to licence fee payers. For example, the issues over the DMI, the digital project they had, the severance payments, and these things. I think many licence fee payers, once they sort of heard about these issues and the details, would be concerned that is their money being well spent. And I think that the other thing to take into account, it receives £3.7 billion a year of licence fee money. That is a huge amount of money. And one thing that we must all do, that includes the committee as well in its functions, is hold it to account, because it's a huge amount of money for any organisation, and it would be rightly expected by everyone is that any organisation that gets that amount of public money should be held fully accountable, and that's why I welcome this process. And what this all means is that when that charter review process does start and take place, there's going to be some very big issues for it to look at. Governance is clearly an important issue. I know that some changes have already been made to governance in the last couple of years to try and get more transparency, more clearer lines of accountability. So that's one issue I think there needs to be a fresh look at. And then funding arrangements, because a lot has changed in the environment the BBC operates in over the last few years. I remember as a child there used to be 3 channels or 4 channels on my TV set, and now there's over 500 channels. We have the internet, which didn't exist when the licence fee clearly was set up, so there's been a big march on technology, and that will clearly continue. And so I think this does mean that we need to sensibly look at these key issues of governance, funding and others to make sure that the BBC that we have after the charter review process is what everyone would agree on.
You say £3.7 billion is a huge amount of money, and therefore they need to be fully accountable. I don't think anybody here will disagree with that. But do you think it's too much money?
I think it's hard to say without really having the evidence which would come out through the charter review process. I think it's clearly what they do with the money is directly related to what output they can produce. What we have seen, which has been positive, I think, over the last few years, as you know, the licence fee has been frozen since 2010, and they have still managed to find savings and been pushed to find savings, and managed to maintain, in most cases, the production, where it's on TV, it's radio, it's online, some cases enhanced production. I believe actually that if you look at the licence fee itself over the 20 years, so today's licence fee compared to what it was 20 years ago, in real terms, it's hardly changed. I think it's something roughly like £147 in real terms then compared to what it is today. Obviously, notwithstanding the change in the number of households, it does show you that the BBC is capable of doing more with less, and I think these are the important things to look at when one tries to determine if it's too much money.
John Leach?
You have indicated that the government is considering repealing Section 73 of the Copyright Designs and Patents Act. What's the argument behind that for doing that?
Are you referring to the balance payments issue?
I'm referring to the BBC and other public service broadcasters paying retransmission fees.
Yeah. So there was I think you're referring to a speech, I made a number of announcements in the speech to the RTS a couple of weeks ago. And that decision to have that review is not really related directly to the BBC. It's when I've looked at these rules, and especially coming in as a sort of new Secretary of State, taking a fresh look at a lot of the rules that affect the broadcasting space, there's many of these rules, and that's one of them, that have been put in place many, many years ago for a very different environment. And the rules around the sort of so-called retransmission issue, originally they were primarily put in place to help the expansion of the cable TV industry. And it was at a time when there were very few cable operators. There were many, but there were very few in terms of penetration. And I think it was designed to help them to grow as a competitor to other types of broadcasting platforms. And I think since then we've moved on considerably, and I think it deserves a fresh look, and that should be done by having a proper review, looking at the evidence and seeing whether these kinds of rules are still necessary.
Would you expect at some point in the future then that cable and satellite operators would be paying the BBC and other PSBs for their content?
No, I haven't decided that yet. I think that would be going too far at this point. I think because these rules have been in place for a long time, and a number of stakeholders have brought up issues, concerns, and some might be positively inclined towards these rules, others would have concerns with them. I think it makes sense to look at them. Alongside that, for example, in the same speech, I announced that, because I think there is a bit of a connection, is a review of the EPG rules, the Electronic Programme Guide, on the question of prominence and who gets prominence and how it works. I think all these issues are related, and I think if we want to continue to have a dynamic broadcasting economy that remains creative, I think it's sensible to look at these rules and decide whether they're fit for purpose.
Well, I was actually going to come on to the EPG and also the compulsion on the part of the satellite and cable operators to give prominence to public sector, public service broadcasting. As part of that review, if say they were to be expected to pay in future to the BBC and to other public service broadcasters, would it be a tit-for-tat approach where they wouldn't necessarily get the prominence on the electronic programming guide?
Well, we've said, first of all, there's no decision has been made. This is a fresh look. It's going to be driven by the evidence and doing an impact analysis of what may or may not happen if you change the rules. But if you look at the current situation, and there is a difference between how it operates within the satellite platforms versus cable. But you do find that if you look at cable, for example, the PSBs have to provide their content for no cost to the cable operators, and the cable operators have to provide them EPG prominence. And I think that these two things are connected, and they should be looked at together.
But you rule nothing in, nothing out.
That's right.
Moving on to the licence fee, what do you see the alternative options to a licence fee being?
Well, first of all, I've made no decision on that. I mean, right now, here and now, and until the charter review, the licence fee will clearly remain. What I would say at the outset, I think the right thing during the charter review process will be to rule out no options, is to take a fresh look at what's the best way of funding the BBC for the long term. The ideas that have been postulated by others and many stakeholders, first of all, the BBC itself, I think, has made it clear they would prefer to keep the licence fee pretty much as it is. There are others that have talked about possibly having a subscription model. Others refer to Channel 4 as an example, which, as you all know, state-owned but commercially funded. So there are various models out there, and I think the charter review should rule nothing out and rule nothing in, and take a fresh look.
You did suggest in June, though, in on the Andrew Marsh show, that you did think that the licence fee was still quite a large amount of money for some families.
That's right. Yeah.
So £3 a week is quite a lot of money for a large number of families.
Oh, I think if you take, well, actually, you've picked £3 a week. The BBC likes to pick 40p a day. But if you take pretty much a lot of bills that households face and divide it by 52 or 365, they do sound a lot less than otherwise. But if you compare that, for example, to the average, if you take the average broadband bill for a household divided by 365, it's about 50p a day. If you take the average Sky subscription, someone's got a Sky subscription divided by 365, it's around £1.60 a day. All these numbers in of themselves can sound quite low. I think you've got to take the number in totality and then look at what you get in return for it.
But in relative terms, compared with a regular Sky subscriber, the BBC is still pretty cheap. And say a comparison of £3 a week to it being less than a quarter of the spare room subsidy, for instance, for someone on housing benefit, it's still significantly less than that.
Well, I mean, that's your view, and I can respect your view, but I don't think you can make decisions about whether something's good value or cheap just by sort of dividing it by a large number and saying, doesn't that sound cheap? I think you've got to look at what you get in return. I don't think it's necessarily the best way of going about it. And the other thing I think to keep in mind when people talk about the license fee is either 40p a day or the number you use, the weekly number, that strictly speaking, that is not the charge for BBC. That is your charge to own a TV set, and it's not the same thing.
No, I was just talking about the cost, but regardless of where that money went to, I was suggesting it was a relatively modest amount in comparison to pay TV.
But I still do, you started with, you're quoting something I said back in June. I do think that your £145.50 a year for some families is a lot of money.
Okay. Some of the alternative models that have been considered are the German model with a tax on all households, or in France and Greece, the TV licence is collected through council tax or utility bills. Are those issues that you would not rule out, options for funding?
I don't rule out anything, but to be clear, I'm not looking today, here and now, I'm not looking at any alternative model. These are the issues I think that would have to be properly addressed when the charter review process starts.
Okay. And are you aware that the committee ran an e-consultation on the Student Room website, which suggested that students supported the licence fee as the funding model for the BBC, but had raised some concerns about the unfairness of student halls of residence to students living in accommodation outside of halls?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but I am aware that there are some concessions on the licence fee to do with a number of issues, either with age or the number of sets and so forth. So I think that where people have concerns, as you've expressed, when the charter process starts, I think that's also a good opportunity for stakeholders like student groups and others to put forward their concerns, and they can be considered.
So do you have a personal view on support for students with licence fees or support for the over 75s with licence fees?
I do on over 75, and I think it's the right thing to do. But that's also just to point out that is not a cost to the BBC. I mean, that is something that's covered through, that concession is covered through general taxation.
Just on that point, could you foresee a situation where the cost of licences for the over 75s might actually come under the money that went to the BBC rather than through DWP?
I mean, we have no such plans, but that is a decision. I mean, others have mooted this. There's been the other stakeholders have talked about something like that, and that's a decision, I think, for the government at the time.
Okay. Finally, in relation to pensioners, would it not be a fairer system to have free TV licences for pensioners on low incomes as opposed to just simply having a cut-off at 75?
Well, because the way the concessions work for older people at the moment, in that they're funded through general taxation rather than a cost for the BBC itself, I think the question you've just asked me is more of a question for the Treasury and maybe DWP. Is not a question, I think, for DCMS.
But hypothetically, if it became a responsibility of the BBC to fund pensioner TV licences, is that something that you would consider looking at, whether or not it was based on ability to pay rather than simply age?
I'm sorry, but I think I have to say that it's not a question for DCMS.
Okay. Ben Bradshaw.
What are your own favourite BBC programmes?
Well, probably the things I watch most regularly, almost every other day, is some news programme. So it used to be Newsnight quite regularly, not so regular anymore. But typically BBC News Channel. No, not that it's too late. I just don't think it's. I don't find it as compelling viewing as it was before. I don't know. Maybe it's got to do with one of the presenters left or something. But I watch the news channel regularly. Other than news, the only thing I think I can definitely say I watch, I won't miss. I might have to record it sometimes, is Doctor Who.
Okay, and so you record it rather than watch?
Sometimes I watch it, but if I know I'm not going to be around at the broadcast time, I would record it.
And do you use the iPlayer?
Not for Doctor Who, no. I have used the iPlayer, of course, yeah.
So your sort of methods of viewing are across the whole range?
Yes.
You seemed reluctant earlier, Secretary of State, to acknowledge that something which costs hardly more than a pint of beer a week does not represent good value for money, given the breadth and quality of the BBC's output. Would you not care to acknowledge that that does represent quite good value for money?
No, my point earlier, and I'll emphasise it again, is that when you take the license fee and divide it by 365, of course it's going to sound cheap. But even if you take that analysis, if you increase the license fee, hypothetically, if it went up by half and it became 60p a week, it will still sound cheap.
So I don't think
just by dividing things by big numbers,
you to acknowledge that it's at its current level, given the quality and range of BBC output, and you yourself gave the comparison with Sky, where the cheapest Sky package is more expensive than the licence fee. You're not even prepared to acknowledge that the BBC represents good value for money.
I don't think that's a job for me. I think that
you're the Secretary of State.
I don't think it's my job to say if it's providing value for money, in the sense that one of the key roles that the trust have is to look at the revenue that the whole BBC organisation receives and determine whether they think it's a good value for money for the licence fee payer. They look at the detail. It's what I can look at is the total amount they receive is 3.7 billion. Obviously, I have a good sense of what their production is, but I don't think I can look into the detail about whether all the pounds and pence that they're getting is being spent properly.
How important a contribution do you think the BBC makes to our overall creative sector?
I think it makes a very important contribution. One example would be, I've seen for myself many examples where it goes out and gets production from the independent sector, which is at least, in terms of their current rules, at least 25%, often more, of what they spend on production. And I think that is very important to the independent production sector.
You mentioned yourself you've been on a recent trip to India. The BBC brand internationally is an incredible, valuable asset to this country. Would you not agree?
I think the evidence shows, certainly when you speak to people, and I've travelled a lot before, even I was in politics, but even now, and it is a very valuable brand abroad.
And all of this taken together, you're still not prepared to acknowledge that the licence fee represents good value for money?
Well, like I said, I don't think I can make that determination. The Trust has a particular role in determining value for money, and what I would look at is the overall amount that it receives of £3.7 billion, but I cannot tell you if every penny is being spent in terms of value for money.
Do you see your role as supporting the BBC?
I see my role as overseeing the BBC, and but I, on my own, I don't determine what the policies will govern the BBC, what the overall role is for years to come. That's something that's determined by many stakeholders, and it's determined at the moment every 10 years through the Charter Review process.
Thanks, Chairman.
Okay. Paul Farrell.
Just in connection with that, I don't usually just throw newspaper clippings at witnesses, but Secretary of State, I want to throw this one at you. It's a piece from the Sunday Telegraph just a few days ago. The headline is "Cut BBC licence fee by at least £50, say Tories." It goes on to say, there are no name quotes, ministers believe it's time to reduce the tax on television ownership and cut it to below £100. One minister said there is a big policy proposal going around to cut the licence fee by £50. The negotiation after the election will be very big. Some cabinet ministers regard £50 as the minimum cut. Are you aware of any policy proposal going around?
No, I'm not. The first time I even heard about those things was when I read it in the paper.
Right. So, do you see £50 as being the minimum cut?
And well, like I said, we've already discussed funding. I'm not going to decide first of all how the BBC should be funded for the longer term, after the Charter Review has taken place, or what the charge should be. You're presupposing that there would always be a licence fee, and I think these are the issues that the Charter Review process needs to look at.
So you disown this article in terms of its accuracy?
Like I said, the first I heard about that, what you've just referred to, was when I read, I think, that what must have been the same article.
Okay.
Just on the licence fee, today you published the terms of reference for the review of the criminalisation of non-payment licence fee. Obviously we won't want to prejudge that, but can I just put to you the question which I raised with the Trust, which is that it has become apparent that the BBC are using powers under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act to chase people evading the licence fee. Do you think that's appropriate use of RIPA powers?
Well, I think this whole issue of how do you, people that aren't paying the licence fee, how do you go after them and try to get them to pay, needs to be looked at very carefully. And that's exactly why we have this review, which is an independent review. And today you would have heard that we've announced through my WMS, we've appointed an eminent QC, David Perry, to lead that review. And I think it's precisely for the kind of question that you've asked, Mr. Chairman, that this needs to be looked at carefully. When the licence fee regime was put in place, it was a long time ago. And some people would argue, for example, that, and I've heard this, is that they'd say, look, you needed to have criminal sanctions because there's no way to sort of cut off someone if they don't pay their fee, like you can cut them off from their electricity utility supplier or something. But clearly times have changed, technology has moved on. And also I think as a question of fairness, when we have seen that I think last year some 200,000 people received a criminal record for not paying their licence fee. Some 50 people roughly went to jail for not paying their licence fee. I think this raises considerable concerns amongst many people, including MPs. I'll give full credit to my colleague, my honourable friend, the member for North West Leicestershire, for bringing this issue to Parliament and getting it debated. But it's for all these reasons I think it should be looked at, and there should be a proper look. It should be independent, and as I said at the start, it will report back in June 2015. That's the planned date, and then we can look at the evidence.
So this is going to feed into the general charter renewal.
That's correct.
It's not going to be done prior to that.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Conor Burns.
Chairman, Secretary of State, you referred in your speech to the Royal Television Society to the explosive growth of the independent production sector, and you also referred to the proposals that Lord Hall has put on the table for changing the BBC's approach to production. Could you just share with us your vision of how that might unfold, how that might change the marketplace?
Yes, I think at the moment, BBC has a lot of in-house production. I think it's 50% of their production is in-house, 25% they will give to, as a matter of course, to independent producers, and then the remaining 25%, it's sort of effectively, I think, competition between the in-house production and external producers. And so, first of all, these quotas, I think it should certainly be part of the charter review process to look at this and see whether it's still fit and whether it's the best set of quotas in terms of, in lots of terms, but especially in terms of helping our creative media sector overall. Tony Hall has also put forward this idea, I think he's called compete and compare, where basically he's saying that even when you have the in-house production, that there should be some kind of external benchmarking to almost try and mimic some competition. I'm not exactly sure how that would actually work, but I do agree with his sort of assessment that the BBC could benefit from more competition in terms of how it takes on work or gives out work, and if this is something that would lead to that, then I sort of welcome his approach in experimenting with it.
And as he himself says, a level playing field doesn't tilt. It's on that point of competition I want to press you, as I did the BBC Trust a little earlier, around the openness and transparency of the BBC in terms of what costs they include in getting to a production cost. Because as you will know, in the private sector, the budgets are incredibly tight. And the private sector, as I understand it, the independents, the smaller companies, welcome this potentially a revolutionary development to the market, which will significantly grow this already rapidly growing sector, but they're concerned that actually there's a possibility, a potential, that if the BBC just puts a lot of it as a sort of arm's length company, that could come to dominate and squeeze out some of the independent production companies. Is that a concern you would share?
Yes, I would. I mean, I think that just given the size of the BBC in our creative media sector, the amount of production each year that it commissions, it clearly has an impact on the market. Notwithstanding, the BBC's has its own internal rules on fair competition and not distorting the market, and that's all sectors of the BBC, not just sort of the commercial arm, as it were, the BBC worldwide. And I think this issue of what kind of impact it has on the market, how it might distort the market, there's an argument where you could say it certainly helps the market grow, but I think people would be concerned if they felt it was stifling innovation and competition. And that's why I think this whole area that you've highlighted, Mr. Burns, needs to be looked at during the charter review process.
And of course the Trust are currently looking at it. Would you, I asked the chairman, the excellent new chairman of the Trust, for an assurance that she would engage with the BBC, but also crucially with the independents, the small private companies, the representatives,
yes.
the trade bodies of those, to make sure that we get the figures out of the BBC, to make sure that we are comparing like with like in terms of production costs.
Yes, I think that's very important, and I would expect the chairman of the Trust, the new chairman of the Trust, to naturally, she would engage with people internally at the BBC on a very regular basis, but also with other players in the sector. And it is very, very early days for her, but I think that she fully understands that and the importance of that.
Thank you.
For most members of the public, the BBC commissions and broadcasts great programmes. But the BBC also does other things. Now, we've been talking about the Director General's proposal to create a standalone BBC production company that will be separate from the rest of the BBC, would be able to compete both for BBC commissions but also for commissions from other broadcasters. Is not the logical next step from that actually to return it or transfer it to the private sector to operate as a private sector company competing for BBC commissioning?
I think, as we just discussed, I think this is an area that does need to be looked at, but I'd be reluctant to say that that is the next logical step because I don't really have the evidence and I haven't looked at it close enough, partly because, as you know, we haven't started the charter review process. But I think when this comes in back to the whole issue of the size of the BBC and does it still need to be doing everything that it does, I think these are very good, legitimate questions. But the answer, I think, has to come out through the charter review process.
So that would form part of the charter
yes.
review?
Yeah.
And the other operation of BBC's, which does operate, as you indicated earlier, entirely commercially, is BBC Worldwide.
Yes.
Would you look at possibly the sale of BBC Worldwide?
I think that has to be part of the charter review process.
And can I just ask you one other question, which is sort of current, particularly after David Abraham's speech in Edinburgh, whether or not the huge changes that are taking place in the independent production sector, particularly in terms of ownership, whether that opens up a question of the terms of trade and whether or not we should look at that again?
I think that is a good question. So, as you'll know, Mr. Chairman, independent producers, most independent producers, they benefit from certain protection on the ownership of their IP at the moment. And I think that was put in place again many years ago to sort of help the growth of that sector. But today, partly because of foreign investment, but not just exclusively, we have some very big independent production houses. Some of them are foreign owned. And the question really is that do they still require that protection in the law that's still there, and what does that protection, what impact does it have on the growth of the market? So where you have a big independent producer, are they now sort of strong enough, big enough to look after their own interests? And
well, they don't have the legal requirements for terms of trade. I mean, the terms of trade only apply to qualifying indies, which
that's right,
a lot of them now don't qualify. So perhaps it's fine.
Yes, but what makes an entity a qualifying indie or not, and then as a result the protection they get, I think that is an area at some point that should be looked at.
Okay. Thank you. Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Chair. Just just returning to governance again. I mean, you've been only a short time in the position of Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Clearly, we've got a new chair of the BBC BBC Trust. But just in your time, and what are your views on how well the BBC Trust has acquitted itself?
I think that, first of all, I think we'd all agree that there's been some, BBC's had to deal with some very significant challenges. They've made some mistakes. And I think it's been well recognised over the last few years that a part of that was down to governance issues, particularly around accountability. So where mistakes have been discovered, who's ultimately responsible, who's taken the decision, and that was recognised to some extent by the Trust itself. So Lord Patton initiated a review whilst he was still there, which reported at the end of last year, and that initiated some changes to try and, I think, make it more transparent, make accountability clearer. Other changes were also made, such as putting more non-executives on the board of the BBC itself. These are all welcome changes. But the question really is that, if the question is that enough in terms of dealing with does it respond correctly to the challenges that were, or the mistakes that were made in the past? I'm not sure. And I think there definitely needs to be a fresh look at what the governance structure should look like during the charter review process. So, for example, some people have said, that should there just be one board to overseeing the BBC without this sort of break between the Trust and the Executive Board? Other ideas out there are, should Ofcom have a role as a sort of regulator for the wider industry? So could some of the sort of functions that the Trust has at the moment be transferred to Ofcom? And or another idea that I've heard about is should there be a trust type structure, but should it be independent of the BBC itself? So should, for example, it not be funded through the licence fee itself and have much more of an arm's length approach? I think these are all good questions. I don't have the answer at this point. I certainly am not in a position to say I think this is the way to improve governance and this is the best structure. There's a lot of examples of best practice out there. I think that should be looked at as well. But this area of governance and the best structure should definitely be looked at the Charter Review.
How do you propose that fresh look should be implemented? How's the whole look at governance going to run as part of the Charter Review?
Well, I don't know what the outcome.
No. How is the fresh look? How's it going to be?
I think the way it would probably start is that at the start of the Charter Review process, the government at the time should postulate its ideas in terms of improvements that can be made, and they could be just a sort of tweak of the existing system, might be one of them. It could be a more wholesale change, and I think it should seek views of other stakeholders on that, and then ultimately come into a decision what it believes is the best way to go forward.
So I think just my final question on this is, because it's all up in the air then, is do you feel that the BBC, without the licence fee, is so central to British life, so important in the British creative industry that whatever body is charged at overseeing how it spends the money and how it's governed should be, whether it's a BBC Trust or an off-BBC, should be distinct because of the importance of the BBC, or have you got an open mind as to whether it should just be merged, as with the rest of the sector, into Ofcom?
No, I think first of all the BBC plays a important part in our cultural life, and I think most people would accept that and recognise that. In terms of your question, should some of the rule or the regulation of it, for example, go to Ofcom? I think these are fair questions, and I don't have a view on that yet. I think that it should definitely be looked at. The reality is, the governance structure we have today, apart from some of the changes that have been made, small changes, it can't be fundamentally changed until we have the charter review process. But given the problems that we've seen and some of the mistakes the BBC has made over the last few years, I think it is only right to take a fresh look at the governance structure and decide whether it's the best way forward.
Can I just ask you two questions on accountability? Firstly, financially, you talked about £3.7 billion.
Yeah.
Obviously, a huge amount of money. A lot of progress has been made in terms of the access of the National Audit Office to the BBC, but when we had the Controller and Auditor General, he said that nevertheless what he would really like is to have statutory right of access, which he doesn't have.
Yeah.
Isn't that a change which could be made very simply and quickly rather than waiting?
No, I think so. I'm aware of that, and as you sort of correctly infers, that the access they've had so far, the NAO, has been an invitation of the BBC, and I think that is it's an important issue that should be looked at, but that is not, as far as I am concerned, I don't think that can change without going through the charter review process. But I will point out recently, it's a sort of related issues, that the BBC has just changed its commercial auditor. Just point out, because I think for 15 years they've been using a particular auditor, and they've just changed it to one of the other big four accounting firms.
And in terms of political accountability, are you going to look at whether or not the Royal Charter actually is the best model for governance of the BBC? Because what it does mean is that Parliament actually has virtually no say on any changes that might be made to the Charter.
Well, I think this is an issue, Mr. Chairman, that does come up at the time of the charter review, and I think the independence of the BBC is hugely important, and the current structure of the Royal Charter, as opposed to, for example, an Act of Parliament, I think is still relevant today, as it for the same reasons it was put in place originally. And so anything that has potentially a big impact on the independence of the BBC, I think should be treated very, very carefully. Notwithstanding that, I think Parliament's role is still important in holding the BBC into account. For example, whether it's through Select Committee or on in the House itself. And what I would absolutely expect, and it would certainly happen if I was the Secretary of State at the time, is that once the Charter the government sort of puts forward its proposals for the Charter, it should certainly be debated in the House, and MPs should be given an opportunity to share their views.
Okay. It is 1 o'clock, unless my colleagues know, in which case can I thank you very much,
Great.
Secretary.
Thank you very much. Thank you.